They say the deadliest things in the underworld come in the sleekest packages. But the streets of New York still whisper about the night the invincible Damian Rossi was minutes away from a bloody grave. He was betrayed, drugged, and completely defenseless. 3 heavily armed hitters stood over his bed, ready to pull the trigger. But they didn't account for Beatrice, the quiet, overweight housekeeper in a floral apron, and they certainly didn't account for the 12-gauge shotgun she kept hidden beneath it. To understand the sheer impossibility of that night, you have to understand the ecosystem of the Rossi syndicate. The Rossi family wasn't just a gang. They were a corporate empire built on blood concrete and shipping ports along the East Coast. At the head of this empire sat Damian Rossi. He was 34, sharply handsome, and possessed eyes as cold and unforgiving as the Atlantic in February. Damian had inherited the throne 6 months prior, following the suspicious car bombing that took the life of his father, the legendary Carlo Rossi. Damian lived in a sprawling, fortified mega-mansion in the Hamptons. The estate was a fortress, disguised as a luxury retreat, boasting reinforced steel gates, biometric locks, and a private security force that rivaled a small military outfit. Inside this fortress mob, captains, corrupt politicians, and high-priced lawyers floated through the marble halls, carving up territories over crystal glasses of scotch. And then there was Beatrice Halstead. To the made men and ruthless killers who frequented the estate, Beatrice was nothing more than furniture. She was the head housekeeper, a woman in her late 40s with a soft, plump figure, round cheeks, and a penchant for wearing sensible orthopedics and faded floral aprons. She was always there, yet entirely invisible. Beatrice dusted the imported chandeliers, scrubbed the blood off the Persian rugs, when a meeting went south and baked fresh focaccia that the capos devoured without ever saying thank you. She was mocked behind her back. The Pillsbury doughgirl Thomas Vane Damian's arrogant head of security called her. They assumed she was a simple, dim-witted woman who was lucky to have a roof over her head. They didn't know her history. They didn't know that Beatrice was the only daughter of Arthur Halstead, one of the most prolific underground armorers and gunsmiths of the 1980s. Arthur had built untraceable weapons for the Irish mob, the Italians, and the cartels. Beatrice had grown up breathing in the smell of Hops No. 9 gun solvent and lead shavings. When her father died with a massive gambling debt owed to the Rossi family, Beatrice had quietly offered her domestic services to Carlo Rossi to pay it off, shielding her younger disabled brother from the mob's wrath. She had spent 12 years in the Rossi household. She knew everything, because people do not lower their voices around the help. She knew that Thomas Vane was skimming from the construction unions. She knew that the rival Lucchese family was quietly buying off Damian's lieutenants. And she knew that Damian Rossi, despite his terrifying public persona, was crumbling under the weight of the crown. Damian was a severe insomniac. Paranoia was eating him alive. He trusted no one, yet he was surrounded by traitors. He would pace the vast library until 4 a.m., nursing a glass of whiskey, jumping at every shadow. Beatrice was the only one who saw this vulnerability. Sometimes she would quietly leave a plate of warm pastries and a cup of chamomile tea on his desk. Damian would never acknowledge her directly, but the plate was always empty by morning. Once, after a particularly brutal assassination attempt on his convoy in Manhattan, Damian had returned to the estate covered in glass and someone else's blood. While his men shouted and scrambled, Beatrice had calmly handed him a warm, damp towel and a clean shirt. He had looked at her, then really looked at her, and whispered a raspy, "Thank you, B." It was a microscopic bond, but to Beatrice, loyalty was an absolute currency. She had paid off her father's debt 3 years ago. She could have left, but she stayed primarily because she knew a storm was coming for the young Don, and she knew the arrogant men guarding him were too blind to see it. The signs were all there. The whispering in the corridors stopped whenever she walked by with her feather duster. Thomas Vane had recently replaced 3 of the most loyal perimeter guards with new, untested muscle from out of state. The security Rottweilers had mysteriously fallen ill and been taken to the vet. The perimeter was being softened. Beatrice knew the mechanics of a hit just as well as she knew how to get red wine stains out of Egyptian cotton. She knew it was going to happen. She just didn't know it would be tonight. It was November 12th, and a vicious nor'easter was battering the Long Island coastline. The wind howled off the ocean, driving sheets of freezing rain against the reinforced glass of the Rossi estate. The storm provided the perfect acoustic cover. No one could hear a muffled gunshot over the roaring thunder. No one could see shadows moving through the rain-slicked gardens. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was suffocating. Damien had spent the entire day in high-stress meetings. By midnight, exhaustion had finally conquered his paranoia. He had taken a double dose of prescription sleeping pills, a dangerous habit he had recently developed, and retired to the master suite on the 2nd floor. He was dead to the world, buried under heavy silk sheets, the heavy oak doors of his bedroom locked tight. Downstairs, the house was eerily quiet. Thomas Vane had dismissed the interior night shift, claiming the storm had shorted out the secondary generator, and he needed the men down at the security compound, near the front gates, to manually monitor the cameras. It was a thinly veiled excuse, but no one questioned the head of security, except Beatrice. Beatrice was in the massive, gleaming commercial kitchen, supposedly preparing the dough for the morning's croissants. The flour dusted her forearms, and her floral apron was securely tied around her thick waist. But she wasn't really baking. She was listening. The silence of the house felt wrong. The usual rhythmic pacing of the hallway guards was missing. The low static of walkie-talkies had vanished. Then she saw it. She walked out of the kitchen with a tray of used espresso cups, heading toward the grand foyer. The lights were dimmed to a low amber. As she passed the side entrance, a heavy security door meant to be used only by the catering staff, she noticed a small puddle of water on the pristine white marble. Beatrice froze. She looked closer. It wasn't just a puddle. It was a partial boot print. She recognized the heavy serrated tread pattern instantly. It was a tactical combat boot. More specifically, it was the tread of a boot that had just walked through the muddy rose garden outside. And there wasn't just one print. There were faint, wet smudges trailing across the marble heading toward the grand staircase. 3 men. Moving light, moving fast. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of placid calm. She didn't scream. Screaming would get her a bullet in the head. Beatrice slowly retreated into the kitchen, placing the tray down on the stainless steel island without making a sound. Her mind raced. The interior alarms hadn't tripped. That meant someone had bypassed the biometrics. Thomas Vane. It had to be Vane. He had sold Damien out. The Lucchese family had finally made their move, and they had bought the keys to the castle. She knew Damien was heavily medicated upstairs. He wouldn't wake up even if a bomb went off. He was a sitting duck. Beatrice moved toward the massive walk-in pantry at the back of the kitchen. She stepped past the rows of imported olive oils, canned San Marzano tomatoes, and bulk bags of flour. At the very back, behind a heavy stack of 50-pound rice bags, was a false wooden panel. Beatrice hadn't touched it in 4 years. With surprising strength, she shoved the rice bags aside. She wedged her thick fingers into the hidden seam of the wood and popped the panel open. Inside the dark recess lay a heavy canvas bag smelling faintly of gun oil and cedar. Beatrice unzipped it. Resting on a bed of velvet was a modified Mossberg 500 pump-action shotgun. Her father had customized it specifically for close-quarters combat. The barrel was sawed down to a brutal illegal length. The stock had been removed and replaced with a pistol grip to make it maneuverable in tight spaces. Beside it sat a bandolier of 12-gauge shells, not standard buckshot, but devastating custom-loaded flechette rounds and heavy slugs designed to tear through Kevlar body armor. Beatrice's hands didn't shake. Her soft, doughy fingers expertly checked the chamber. She loaded the heavy red shells into the tubular magazine, the click-clack of the metal mechanisms completely drowned out by a massive clap of thunder outside. She slung the bandolier over her shoulder, letting it rest diagonally across her floral apron. She gripped the shotgun. The weapon looked almost comical in her hands, this matronly, overweight woman holding a weapon of mass destruction. But her eyes were no longer the eyes of a subservient maid. They were the eyes of Arthur Halstead's daughter. She clicked the safety off. It was time to clean house. Upstairs, the heavy silence of the second-floor corridor was broken only by the faint click of lock-picking tools. 3 professional hitmen stood outside the doors of the master suite. They were dressed in black tactical gear, wearing ski masks and lightweight Kevlar vests. They were led by Dominic, the Ghost, Ferrara, a notoriously sadistic freelance operator who had a reputation for leaving no witnesses. Dominic signaled to his men. The plan was simple, bought and paid for by the Lucchese family for $5 million. Thomas Vane had given them the exact layout, disabled the cameras, and guaranteed that Damien Rossi was heavily sedated. Walk in, put 2 suppressed bullets into the Don's head while he slept, and walk out before the storm passed. The heavy oak doors clicked open. Dominic pushed the doors wide, stepping into the luxurious, shadowy bedroom. The only light came from the lightning flashes outside, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. There, in the center of the massive king-sized bed, lay Damien Rossi. His chest rose and fell in a slow, deep rhythm. Dominic raised his suppressed Heckler and Coke MK, .23 pistol, aiming the laser sight directly at the center of Damien's forehead. He smiled beneath his mask. It was almost too easy. Creak. The sound was tiny, just a slight depression of the floorboards in the hallway outside the open bedroom door. Dominic paused. He didn't turn around immediately, assuming it was one of his men shifting their weight. But his peripheral vision caught movement. Standing in the doorway framed by the dim hallway lights was a silhouette that made absolutely no sense to the trained killer's brain. It was wide and soft, what the one of the hitmen whispered, lowering his weapon slightly in pure confusion. Beatrice stood there, her orthopedic shoes planted firmly on the hardwood floor. The floral apron was bright against the gloom. Her hair, usually pinned up in a neat bun, had a few loose strands framing her round, flushed face. She didn't say a word. She didn't scream for help. She simply raised the Mossberg 500 from beneath the folds of her apron, leveling the shortened barrel directly at the chest of the closest hitman. "Hey, lady, don't—" Boom! The roar of the 12-gauge in the enclosed space was apocalyptic. It was a concussive shockwave that shattered the bedroom windows and blew the eardrums of everyone in the room. The custom flechette round caught the first hitman dead center. Kevlar is designed to stop pistol rounds, not a point-blank blast from a 12-gauge loaded with razor-sharp steel darts. The kinetic force picked the 200-pound man off his feet and hurled him backward into a priceless antique armoire, reducing it to splinters. He was dead before he hit the ground. Dominic and the second hitman flinched, blinded by the massive muzzle flash. Panic and disbelief scrambled their training. Shuck-chuck. Beatrice ruthlessly pumped the action, ejecting the smoking red hull onto the carpet. Her face was completely expressionless, cold as granite. The second hitman swung his submachine gun wildly toward her, his finger tightening on the trigger. Beatrice fired again. Boom! A heavy lead slug tore through the air, completely obliterating the hitman's weapon and taking a massive chunk of his shoulder with it. He spun like a top, screaming in agony, spraying blood across the white silk wallpaper before collapsing onto the floor, clutching his ruined arm. On the bed, the sheer concussive force and deafening noise finally broke through the chemical wall of Damien's sleeping pills. The Don jolted awake, gasping for air, his brain struggling to process the nightmare unfolding in his bedroom. His vision was blurry, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. He tasted cordite and copper in the air. Through the lingering grey smoke, Damien saw a surreal painting of violence. His bedroom was destroyed. 2 men lay bleeding on the floor. Standing over them with the barrel of a smoking shotgun pointed right at the remaining intruder was Beatrice, his maid. Dominic Ferrara, veteran of a dozen gang wars, was frozen in shock. He stared at the plump woman in the apron. He had planned for guards. He had planned for dogs. He hadn't planned for a middle-aged housekeeper wielding a pump-action shotgun like a seasoned trench soldier. Dominic raised his pistol, aiming for Beatrice's head. "You fat bee." Beatrice didn't flinch. She stepped forward, closing the distance, and smoothly pumped the action a 3rd time. Shuck-chuck. "Mind your language in this house," Beatrice said, her voice mild and even completely devoid of adrenaline. She pulled the trigger. The blast caught Dominic in the knee, blowing his leg entirely out from under him. He shrieked, collapsing onto the Persian rug, dropping his gun as he writhed in absolute agony. Silence descended on the room, save for the moans of the 2 surviving hitmen and the howling wind outside. The smell of sulfur, burnt gunpowder, and copper was suffocating. Beatrice lowered the shotgun slightly. She reached into her apron pocket with her left hand, pulled out a small cloth, and meticulously wiped a splatter of blood off her cheek. Damien pushed himself up against the headboard, his chest heaving, his eyes wide, with a mixture of terror and utter bewilderment. He looked at the bodies, then looked at Beatrice. "Bee!" Damien rasped his voice, cracking the heavy fog of the sedatives still pulling at his brain. What the hell is happening?" Beatrice turned to him. For a moment, she looked just like the woman who brought him chamomile tea. Her eyes softened slightly, though her grip on the shotgun remained white-knuckled. "We have a pest problem, Mr. Rossi," Beatrice said, calmly ejecting the spent shell and loading a fresh one from her bandolier without looking down. "Thomas Vane let them in. He disabled the interior alarms. The estate is compromised." Damien stared at her, trying to reconcile the apron with the carnage. How do you—" "My father was Arthur Halstead," she said simply, as if that explained everything. To a don of the underworld, it did. Damien's eyes widened in sudden recognition of the legendary name. Before Damien could process it further, a crackle of static echoed from the radio, clipped to Dominic's tactical vest on the floor. "Ghost sitrep!" Thomas Vane's voice crackled through the radio. "I heard noise. Is the package wrapped? You have 3 minutes before the exterior patrol swings back." Beatrice walked over to the writhing assassin, pressing the smoking hot barrel of the shotgun against his uninjured leg. Dominic whimpered, shaking his head frantically. Beatrice reached down, unclipped the radio and held it to her mouth. She pressed the transmit button. "Mr. Vane," Beatrice said, her polite, subservient tone dripping with a terrifying menace. "Mr. Rossi will not be seeing any more visitors tonight. I suggest you run." She tossed the radio onto the floor and crushed it beneath her orthopedic heel. She turned back to Damien, who was finally throwing off the heavy blankets, his survival instincts kicking in. "Get dressed, sir," Beatrice said, marching over to the heavy bedroom door and peeking out into the dark hallway. "There are at least 15 of Vane's men between us and the underground garage. We're going to have to fight our way out." Damien stood up, wearing nothing but his silk pajama pants, staring at his chubby middle-aged housekeeper, who was currently doing a tactical sweep of his hallway. The invincible Mafia Don realized in that moment that the most dangerous person in his empire had been washing his dishes for 12 years. "Lead the way, B," Damien said, picking up the fallen MK-23 pistol from the floor. The night was just beginning. The corridor outside the master suite was a cavern of shadows. The storm had finally knocked out the main power grid of the Southampton Peninsula, plunging the Rossi estate into a suffocating darkness, save for the strobe light flashes of lightning tearing through the skylights. The backup generators, heavily tampered with by Thomas Langdon's men, had failed to engage. Damien Rossi, wearing nothing but a black cashmere sweater, hastily pulled over his silk pajama pants, leaned heavily against the mahogany wainscoting. His heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs. The cocktail of Ambien and adrenaline in his bloodstream was making his vision swim, but the cold steel of the Heckler & Koch MK-23 in his right hand grounded him. He looked ahead. Beatrice was moving with a terrifying, fluid grace that entirely contradicted her soft, heavy-set frame. She had traded her sensible orthopedic shoes for a pair of discarded tactical boots, taken from one of the dead hitmen in the bedroom. They were 2 sizes too big, but they wouldn't slip on the bloody marble floors. Her floral apron, now splattered with dark crimson, billowed slightly as she methodically sliced the pie at the corner of the hallway, leading with the shortened barrel of her Mossberg 500. "Clear," Beatrice whispered, her voice barely carrying over the howling wind. "B," Damien hissed, wiping a bead of cold sweat from his temple. "Langdon hired ex-contractors from Academy and Ironbridge Security. They aren't street thugs. They have night vision and level 4 ceramic plates. That shotgun won't penetrate center mass." Beatrice didn't look back, her eyes scanning the dark landing of the grand staircase. "My father taught me about level 4 plates when I was 12, Mr. Rossi. Ceramic stops high-velocity rifle rounds. It does not stop a 1-ounce lead slug from shattering the pelvic girdle or removing the lower mandible. Stay low, stay behind me, and watch the flanks." Damien swallowed hard. A bizarre, undeniable wave of awe washed over him. For months he had been suffocating under the weight of his father's empire, surrounded by sycophants and vipers, waiting for the knife in the dark. Now the only person standing between him and a shallow grave was a woman he had completely ignored for 12 years. And God, she was magnificent in her element. As they reached the top of the grand sweeping staircase that overlooked the foyer, the faint chirp of a 2-way radio broke the silence. "Team Alpha, move up the east wing. He's not in the suite. The ghost is unresponsive." A voice crackled from the darkness below. Beatrice threw a hand back, pressing her palm flat against Damien's chest, stopping him dead in his tracks. The physical contact was electric, a sharp contrast of soft, warm skin against his racing heart. She pulled him down behind the heavy marble balustrade, just as 3 narrow green laser sights pierced the gloom of the lower foyer, sweeping across the vaulted ceiling. 3 men in full tactical gear were fanning out at the base of the stairs, their suppressed M4 carbines raised. 3 tangos, Damien whispered, his tactical training kicking in. "Staircase is a fatal funnel. If we move, they'll chew us to pieces." "We don't move," Beatrice replied softly, her hands deftly loading 2 more heavy slugs into the shotgun's magazine. "We make them look the wrong way." She reached into the deep pocket of her apron and pulled out a heavy crystal paperweight, a solid glass globe she had dusted on Damien's desk just yesterday. Without hesitation, she lobbed it over the balcony, aiming for the massive antique mirror hanging on the far wall of the foyer. Crash! The mirror shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. The three mercenaries instantly pivoted toward the noise, their laser sights converging on the far wall, their trigger fingers twitching. "Now," Beatrice commanded. She popped up over the balustrade, braced the pistol grip of the Mossberg against her hip, and unleashed hell. Boom! The first slug struck the lead mercenary just below the edge of his Kevlar vest, obliterating his hip joint. He screamed, folding in half and tumbling violently to the floor. Boom! The second shot caught the man to the left perfectly in the throat. His armor was completely bypassed. He dropped like a stone, his weapon clattering uselessly across the Italian tile. The third mercenary spun around his night vision goggles, giving him a clear view of the muzzle flash on the balcony. He opened fire. A suppressed burst of 5. 56mm rounds chewed through the marble balustrade, mere inches from Beatrice's face, showering her in razor-sharp stone shrapnel. She flinched, falling backward onto the carpet. A shallow gash opened across her cheek. Before the mercenary could adjust his aim, Damien was on his feet. The lingering fog in his brain vanished, replaced by a sudden, violent, possessive rage. Seeing Beatrice bleed triggered something primal inside the Mafia Don. Damien leaned over the railing, acquired the target in a fraction of a second, and fired the MK-23. Crack, crack, crack. 3 hollow-point rounds punched through the top of the mercenary's helmet, dropping him instantly in a sprawl of tactical gear and silence. Damien dropped to his knees beside Beatrice, his hands hovering over her face. "Bay, are you hit? Look at me." Beatrice blinked, wiping the blood from her cheek with the back of her hand. She looked up at him, her chest heaving, the adrenaline finally starting to break through her icy exterior. "It's just a scratch, Mr. Rossi. Stone fragments." "Damien," he corrected his voice, rough, his dark eyes locking onto hers in the gloom. "Call me Damien. If we're going to die together, you can drop the formalities." A small, breathless laugh escaped her lips. "Damien, then. We need to keep moving. The garage. If Langdon locked down the perimeter, the armored Maybach in the subterranean vault is our only battering ram out of here." He helped her up his hand, lingering on her arm a second longer than necessary. The shift in their dynamic was palpable. The invisible maid was gone. In her place was a partner, the only equal he had found in a world of cutthroats. The descent into the subterranean garage was a claustrophobic nightmare. The service stairwell smelled of ozone-damp concrete and the faint coppery tang of blood. Damien took point, his pistol raised, while Beatrice covered their rear, the shotgun tracking every shadow. They reached the heavy reinforced steel door leading to the garage. Damien punched his master override code into the biometric keypad. A red light flashed. Access denied. "Langdon wiped the system," Damien cursed under his breath, striking the keypad with the butt of his gun. "We're locked out." Beatrice stepped forward. "Move aside." She raised the Mossberg, aimed directly at the heavy magnetic locking mechanism at the top of the doorframe, and fired a slug point blank. The deafening blast in the enclosed stairwell was agonizing, but the reinforced lock shattered into jagged metal teeth. Damien threw his shoulder against the heavy steel, and the door groaned open. They spilled into the cavernous, dimly lit subterranean garage. The air was thick with the smell of high-octane fuel and expensive leather. Row upon row of luxury vehicles sat in the gloom Ferrari's Range Rovers, and at the very back, the prize, a matte black Mercedes Maybach S600 Guard, built with VR-10 ballistic protection capable of withstanding armor-piercing bullets and explosive charges. But standing between them and the Maybach was Thomas Langdon. The head of security stood in the center of the garage, flanked by 6 heavily armed men. Langdon was a tall, meticulously groomed man in his late 40s, wearing a tailored tactical suit. He held a custom Sig Sauer MCX rifle, casually resting it against his shoulder. He looked incredibly bored. "I have to admit, Damien," Langdon's voice echoed off the concrete walls, smooth and dripping with condescension. "When Ferrara didn't report back, I assumed you had a panic room I didn't know about. I never imagined you were being babysat by the help." Langdon's eyes drifted to Beatrice trailing over her bloodied floral apron and the massive shotgun in her hands. He let out a dark chuckle. "Beatrice Halstead, I thought I told you to stick to the laundry. Arthur would be rolling in his grave if he saw his little girl playing gangster." Beatrice's grip on the shotgun tightened until her knuckles turned white. "My father was twice the man you are, Thomas. Your father was a stubborn old fool." Langdon sneered, taking a slow step forward, signaling his men to fan out and encircle them. He thought he had principles, building guns for the mob but refusing to build the special toys. Remember that the incendiary payloads he refused to manufacture for my side hustle in '98. Damien stepped slightly in front of Beatrice, shielding her with his body. "Langdon, you sold me out to the Lucchese family. You let them into my home. You're a dead man." Langdon laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "The Lucchese's, oh Damien, you're still so naive, just like Carlo. The Lucchese's are paying me tonight, yes, but I haven't worked for the Rossi family in a decade. I work for myself." Langdon leveled his rifle at Damien's chest. "Who do you think planted the car bomb that turned your father into a charcoal briquette, Damien? The Lucchese's didn't have the internal access. I did." Carlo was getting soft. He was talking about going legitimate, moving the shipping ports to legal contracts. I couldn't let that happen. Bad for business. Damien's blood ran cold. The grief and rage that had been simmering inside him for 6 months boiled over into sheer, white-hot fury. It was Langdon, the man who had carried his father's casket. "And as for you, sweetheart," Langdon sneered, looking back at Beatrice, "your father didn't die with a gambling debt to the Rossi family. He never owed Carlo a dime." Beatrice froze. The air left her lungs. "What?" "I made the debt up," Langdon confessed, smiling cruelly. "Arthur refused to build my weapons, so I put a bullet in his head, forged a ledger, and brought it to Carlo. I told the Don that Arthur owed us. And you, like a good little martyr, walked right into our house to pay off a phantom debt. 12 years, Beatrice. 12 years you scrubbed my toilets and baked my bread, working off a debt that never existed. You've been a slave to the man who murdered your father." The silence that followed was heavier than the concrete ceiling above them. Damien looked at Beatrice. He expected to see her break. He expected tears or a collapse. Instead, he saw a terrifying, hollow calm settle over her features. The plump, quiet maid vanished, entirely replaced by an apex predator. "Thank you for telling me, Thomas," Beatrice whispered, her voice carrying an icy, lethal resonance. Before Langdon could react, Beatrice didn't aim the shotgun at him. She aimed it at the ceiling above Langdon's men, directly at the high-pressure fire suppression sprinkler pipes that ran across the garage. Boom! The slug ripped through the heavy iron pipe. Instantly, thousands of gallons of foul, stagnant, rust-colored water exploded downward in a torrential downpour, completely blinding Langdon and his men. The sudden deluge sounded like a freight train, knocking 2 of the mercenaries off their feet and severely obscuring the mercenaries' thermal and night vision optics. "Move!" Beatrice roared over the sound of the rushing water. Damien didn't hesitate. He grabbed her arm, and together they dove behind the solid steel engine block of a nearby Bentley as Langdon's men opened fire blindly into the spray. The deafening roar of automatic gunfire chewed the concrete around them to dust, shattering the windows of the surrounding luxury cars. "The Maybach!" Damien shouted over the chaos, checking his magazine. "It's 30 yards away. We can't outgun 6 rifles." Beatrice reached into her apron again. She didn't pull out a paperweight this time. She pulled out a sleek, black, rectangular block of C4 plastic explosive, roughly the size of a brick, fitted with a crude analog timer dial. Damien stared at it in horror. "Are you out of your mind? Where did you get that?" "My father's stash behind the pantry," Beatrice said grimly, her fingers twisting the dial to 30 seconds. "He didn't just build guns, he built contingencies." She pressed the arming button. A tiny red light began to blink rapidly. "Damien," she said, looking him dead in the eye, the pouring water from the ceiling plastering her hair to her face. "When I throw this, it is going to ignite the fuel lines of every car in that row. The overpressure in this enclosed space will turn our internal organs to jelly if we aren't inside the armored Maybach when it detonates." 30 yards, Damien said, his jaw set, his eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, unwavering trust. "On my mark, we run. I'll lay suppressing fire. You just get to the door." "Don't die, Damien," she whispered, her voice suddenly trembling, betraying the raw human emotion she had been suppressing all night. Damien reached out his hand, cupping her soft, wet cheek. He pulled her close, kissing her forehead, a promise sealed in blood and cordite. "I just found you, B. I'm not losing you now." He racked the slide of his MK-23. 3, 2, 1. Mark. Beatrice hurled the brick of C4 in a high arc over the Bentley, sending it sailing toward the cluster of Range Rovers where Langdon's men were taking cover. Simultaneously, Damien stood up from cover and began rapid-firing his pistol, precisely targeting the muzzle flashes through the blinding waterfall. One mercenary dropped a bullet, catching him in the exposed collarbone. "Run!" Damien bellowed. They sprinted across the slick, flooded concrete. Bullets whizzed past them like angry hornets, striking the pillars and ricocheting off the floor. Beatrice's lungs burned, her heavy legs pumping as she pushed herself harder than she ever had in her life. She reached the heavy reinforced door of the Maybach and yanked it open, diving headfirst into the luxurious leather back seat. Damien dove in a fraction of a second later, violently pulling the heavy armored door shut behind him. The heavy thud of the door locking sealed them in total soundproof silence. Through the bulletproof glass, Damien saw Thomas Langdon realize what the blinking red brick on the hood of the Range Rover was. He saw Langdon's eyes widen in absolute terror as he turned to run. "Cover your ears and open your mouth," Beatrice screamed, grabbing Damien and pulling him down to the floorboards. The timer hit 0. The explosion did not sound like a boom. It sounded like the world tearing in half. Inside the sealed soundproof cabin of the armored Maybach, the detonation was experienced as a massive concussive wave of pure kinetic violence. A blinding sphere of white-hot plasma expanded from the cluster of Range Rovers, instantly vaporizing the deluge of water raining from the ceiling. The shockwave hit the Maybach like a freight train dropped from a skyscraper. The 6-ton luxury vehicle was lifted entirely off its reinforced suspension, violently slammed sideways across the wet concrete. Damien covered Beatrice with his own body, pressing her deep into the plush leather floorboards, as the VR-10 ballistic glass surrounding them spiderwebbed under the immense atmospheric pressure, turning completely opaque, but miraculously holding firm. Outside, the subterranean garage became an apocalyptic furnace. The C4 had successfully ignited the high-octane fuel lines of the surrounding vehicles. A chain reaction of secondary explosions ripped through the enclosed space, sending flaming tires, heavy engine blocks, and shrapnel ricocheting off the concrete walls like shrapnel inside a frag grenade. For 30 agonizing seconds they lay tangled together in the darkness of the floorboards. The only sound, the ragged, desperate panting of their own breath, and the muffled, vibrating roar of the inferno raging inches from their faces. Slowly the violent rocking of the car ceased. Damien groaned, his ears ringing despite the soundproofing, his muscles aching from the impact. He pushed himself up his hands, instinctively, checking Beatrice for injuries. "Bea!" he gasped, his voice raw. "Are you in one piece?" Beatrice sat up, slowly wiping a mixture of sweat and dried blood from her brow. She looked at him, her eyes wide, but terrifyingly clear. "I'm alive." The glass held. "German engineering," Damien muttered, a hysterical, breathless laugh escaping his lips. He scrambled over the heavy center console, hauling himself into the driver's seat. He slammed his foot on the brake and hit the ignition button. The massive V12 bi-turbo engine roared to life, a deep, guttural growl that vibrated through the chassis. Through the cracked, spider-webbed windshield, the garage was a vision of hell. Thick, oily black smoke choked the air. The bodies of Langdon's men were gone, consumed by the twisted, burning wreckage of the luxury cars. The heavy steel garage doors leading to the exterior driveway were buckled outward from the pressure of the blast, hanging off their massive hinges. "Hold on," Damien shouted. He threw the transmission into drive, gripped the steering wheel, and slammed the accelerator to the floor. The heavy Maybach surged forward. It plowed through the burning skeleton of a Ferrari, the reinforced steel bumper shattering the debris like brittle plastic. Damien aimed the massive vehicle directly at the buckled steel doors. With a deafening screech of rending metal, the Maybach smashed through the doors, bursting out of the subterranean inferno and into the freezing torrential rain of the nor'easter. The cold night air whipped across the hood as they fishtailed onto the slick cobblestone driveway. The storm was raging, lightning, illuminating the manicured grounds of the estate, now a battleground of flashing emergency lights in the distance. "Wait!" Beatrice suddenly commanded, her voice cutting through the adrenaline-fueled chaos. "Stop the car!" "Are you insane?" Damien yelled, fighting the steering wheel to keep the heavy car on the driveway. "Vane's exterior men are going to converge on us any second." "Stop the damn car, Damien!" Beatrice roared, a fierce, commanding authority in her tone that left absolutely no room for argument. Damien slammed on the brakes. The Maybach skidded to a halt on the wet grass near the edge of the property's massive wrought-iron gates. Beatrice was staring out the cracked passenger window. Following her gaze, Damien saw it. Crawling through the mud, desperately dragging his ruined body toward the tree line, was Thomas Langdon. The blast had thrown him clear of the immediate incineration zone, but he had not escaped the fire. His tailored tactical suit was scorched and melting into his skin. His left arm hung at a grotesque angle, and his face was severely burned, half of his hair singed away. Beatrice grabbed the Mossberg shotgun from the back seat. She racked the action, loading one final devastating slug into the chamber. "Stay here," she said quietly. "Bea, no." Damien reached for her arm, but she pulled away her eyes, cold and empty. "He murdered my father, Damien. He stole 12 years of my life. This isn't Mafia business. This is blood." She kicked the heavy armored door open and stepped out into the freezing rain. The storm immediately soaked her, plastering the bloody, soot-stained floral apron to her legs. She walked with slow, deliberate purpose, the heavy shotgun resting against her hip, the rain washing the blood from her face. Langdon heard the crunch of her tactical boots on the gravel. He rolled onto his back, groaning in agony, his scorched face twisting in terror as he looked up at the plump, unassuming woman looming over him like the angel of death. "Bea! Beatrice, please!" Langdon coughed a wet, rattling sound, blood bubbling at the corner of his lips. We can make a deal. I have offshore accounts. Millions in the Cayman Islands. I'll give it all to you." Beatrice looked down at him, her expression utterly devoid of pity. The rain battered them both, washing the mud over Langdon's trembling fingers. "You told my father he owed a debt," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifying whisper that barely carried over the thunder. "You lied." But you were right about one thing, Thomas. She raised the shortened barrel of the shotgun, pointing it directly at the center of his forehead. The red laser sight from Damien's MK-23 inside the car suddenly painted Langdon's chest. Damien was covering her, watching her back. Debts must be paid, Beatrice finished. No, wait, boom! The final shot echoed across the Hamptons estate, merging with a massive crack of thunder. Beatrice didn't look down at the gruesome result. She turned on her heel, the smoking shotgun in her hand, and walked back to the idling Maybach. She climbed into the passenger seat, pulled the heavy door shut, and carefully placed the weapon by her feet. She looked at Damien. Her chest was heaving, her hands finally beginning to tremble as the sheer weight of what she had done crashed over her. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind raw, agonizing grief. Damien didn't say a word. He reached across the console, took her trembling, blood-stained hand in his, and gripped it tight. "It's over," he whispered fiercely. "I've got you." He threw the car into gear, smashed through the heavy security gates of his own home, and disappeared into the raging black storm, leaving the burning ruins of his old life behind. 3 months later. The atmosphere inside the private dining room of Il Tevere, an exclusive mob-run establishment in the heart of Brooklyn, was suffocatingly tense. The mahogany table was surrounded by the aging, ruthless heads of the 5 families. Among them sat Carmine the Bull Lucchese, the man who had bankrolled the assassination attempt on Damien Rossi. Carmine sat back, sipping his espresso, a confident, arrogant smirk playing on his lips. For 3 months, Damien Rossi had been a ghost. The underworld assumed the young Don had fled the country after his estate burned to the ground. Carmine had been quietly absorbing the Rossi shipping territories, preparing to officially claim the throne of New York. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. The room fell dead silent. Damien Rossi walked in. He looked entirely different from the paranoid, exhausted insomniac of months past. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit, his posture radiating a lethal, untouchable confidence. He wasn't flanked by a dozen massive bodyguards. He was flanked by one person. Beatrice walked beside him, commanding the room with a terrifying, silent gravity. The faded floral apron was gone. She was dressed in a sharp, custom-made navy blue pantsuit that flattered her heavy, imposing frame. Her hair was swept up in an elegant, severe twist. The faint, jagged scar across her cheek, a souvenir from the marble shrapnel, caught the dim lighting of the chandelier. Carmine Lucchese lowered his espresso cup, narrowing his eyes. He recognized her. "Rossi, you brought your maid to a sit-down. Have you lost your mind?" Damien didn't smile. He walked to the head of the table, pulling out a chair, not for himself, but for Beatrice. She sat down with cold composure. Damien stood behind her, resting his hands lightly on her shoulders. "Gentlemen." Damien's voice was smooth, carrying a terrifying, quiet menace. "I'd like to formally introduce my new consigliere and equal partner in the Rossi syndicate, Beatrice Halstead." A few of the older dons exchanged bewildered glances. Carmine scoffed loudly. "A woman, a maid. You disrespect this table, Damien. Your father would be ashamed." Beatrice leaned forward, resting her forearms on the mahogany wood. "My father was Arthur Halstead," she said softly. The name sent a visible ripple of unease around the table. Everyone in that room had bought weapons from the legendary armorer in the 80s. "And unlike my father," Beatrice continued, her voice as hard as cold steel, "I do not build weapons for my enemies. I eliminate them." She reached into a designer handbag, pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger, and tossed it onto the center of the table. It landed with a heavy thud. "That," Beatrice said, staring directly into Carmine Lucchese's eyes, "is a detailed, encrypted list of every offshore account, every dirty politician, and every bribed Port Authority official tied to the Lucchese family. Thomas Langdon kept meticulous records before he died. I spent the last 3 months decrypting them. Carmine's arrogant smirk vanished. His face went pale. I have already forwarded copies of this ledger to the FBI field office in Manhattan, scheduled on a dead man's switch, Beatrice stated calmly, folding her hands together. If Damien or I so much as catch a cold, the entire Lucchese enterprise goes to federal prison for the next 3 lifetimes. The silence in the room was absolute. The other dons shifted uncomfortably, realizing the tectonic plates of the New York underworld had just shifted entirely. The Rossi family wasn't dead. They had evolved into something far more dangerous. They had a tactical genius at the helm. Carmine swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple. What do you want, Rossi? Damien leaned down his face, mere inches from Beatrice's ear, his eyes locked on Carmine. I want your docks. I want your construction unions. And I want you to retire to Florida by the end of the week. If I see your face in New York again, my consigliere won't use a ledger. She'll use a shotgun. Carmine looked at the plump, scarred woman sitting at the table. He saw no bluff in her eyes. He saw only the cold, mechanical certainty of an executioner. Slowly defeated, Carmine nodded. The meeting was over. 20 minutes later, Damien and Beatrice were sitting in the back of a new armored SUV, driving through the neon-lit streets of Manhattan. The partition separating them from the driver was up, giving them total privacy. The tension of the sit-down melted away. Damien poured 2 glasses of aged Macallan scotch from the car's minibar and handed one to Beatrice. She took it, a soft, genuine smile, finally breaking through her stoic exterior. They were terrified of you, Damien. No, Damien corrected softly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. They were terrified of you, B. I'm just the guy smart enough to stand behind you. Beatrice laughed softly, the sound warm and rich. The transformation over the last 3 months had been profound. In the aftermath of the estate fire, hiding in a secure brownstone in Brooklyn, they had built a bond forged in blood and survival. Damien had helped her heal from the trauma of her father's betrayal. She had helped him conquer the crushing anxiety that had plagued his leadership. She looked out the window at the passing city lights. I never imagined this. 12 years scrubbing floors. I thought I would die in that house. Damien set his glass down. He moved across the leather seat, closing the distance between them. He reached out gently, tracing the scar on her cheek with his thumb. You kept me alive, Bay, he murmured, his voice thick with raw emotion. When the whole world wanted me dead, you stood in the doorway with a 12-gauge and fought the devil for me. I owe you my life. I owe you my empire. Beatrice looked up into his dark, intense eyes. The dynamic between them had shifted from protector and protected to master and servant to equals. But beneath the power and the violence, there was a deeply rooted, undeniable fire. You don't owe me anything, Damien, she whispered. Then let me give it to you anyway, he replied. He leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss that was a long time coming. It wasn't a soft, hesitant kiss. It was fierce, desperate and possessive, a sealing of their partnership in the deepest sense. Beatrice's hands, the same hands that had ruthlessly dismantled a squad of mercenaries, tangled in his dark hair, pulling him closer, anchoring him to her. They were the new king and queen of the concrete jungle. He was the charismatic, ruthless face of the Rossi Empire. She was the brilliant, untouchable tactical mind operating in the shadows. Together, they were invincible. The assassins had aimed at the sleeping Mafia don, but they had awakened a monster, and they had unleashed his queen. If this adrenaline-fueled Mafia romance had you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Who else wants a full movie of Beatrice showing the underworld exactly who's boss? Drop a comment below with your favorite moment. Was it the explosive escape or the epic sit-down with the Dons? Make sure to share this story with your friends who love dark romance, incredible plot twists, and absolute badasses. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next gripping original story. See you in the next video.